Welcome to Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. I invite you to join me on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful as a participant in the great conversation, and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. So if you're listening today and you know that I have David Hicks here, this is one of my most exciting moments of my life because, as you all know, this book, Norms and Nobility, is the staple of classical education along with Abolition of Man. And I'm thrilled today to introduce my audience to David Hicks. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adrian. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
So we have so many things to talk about. As you know, it was very difficult for me to narrow down the topics because you're doing so many good things. And so Norms and Nobility is something you worked on a long time ago. Obviously, we have to talk about that. But before we talk about that, I wanted to have our listeners kind of hear a little bit about some of your new projects. And before we get into the new project that we're going to dive into, why don't you tell our listeners how you got into education?
Well, I got into it the way we all get into it. I went to school in the first grade and spent a lot of time in school before I was an adult. I was very blessed. I had wonderful teachers, very strong mentors. My parents sent me to a Christian boys boarding school on Long Island when I was 12 or 13. Spent 5 years there, had fabulous teachers there, just very wonderful, devout, in some cases brilliant teachers. And then, I had a good undergraduate experience at Princeton, and then I did my graduate work in philosophy at Oxford, and I just kept running into people who were very influential and very good teachers, and forming strong relationships with them. And so that by the time, then I went into the Navy after doing a little postgraduate work in Moscow where they thought I was a CIA agent, which was kind of amusing. But then I went into the Navy and I was supposed to go actually to Vietnam. The Vietnam War was just winding down. And my orders were changed at the last minute, and they sent me to the Naval War College and put me on the faculty there. So I was thrown right into the fire immediately, but I enjoyed that. And also my job was to teach historical case studies. And up until then, my education has been, I think, pretty deficient in history. My case study was Thucydides, which was fantastic. I love Thucydides. I think everybody ought to read it at least once. And from there, I just got recruited into initially the university level, and I was not happy with that. Went into politics for a while. And my old headmaster from Stony Brook, which was the boys' school I went to, he reached out to me in the middle of all of this. He had worked up getting to norms now. He had developed a relationship with Beaufort Jones at the Woodruff Foundation in Atlanta. They were interested in doing a critical study of what was then high school education and proposing some improvements to it. This is post-Sputnik and other things, and suddenly the standardized testing results in America after 1966 started declining, and so there's some worry about that. So he had arranged for me to study this problem. I visited a lot of schools and proposed some changes. I think they were looking for more or less just incremental sort of standard changes. But I came to the opinion at the end of the year that wasn't that we really had headed off in the wrong direction, that we were asking the wrong questions, and that we had departed from, and this is of course what Dorothy Sayers talks about in her Lost Tools, that we had lost a lot of what the tradition, the history, our heritage had bequeathed to us. and based it upon a lot of theoretical thinking of social scientists. And I've come to actually this, when I talk about this new book of mine, The Stones Cry Out, I mean, it's largely, I mean, one of its sub themes is kind of an attack on the social sciences and the theoretical thinking that dominates now modern thinking. Of course, Dostoevsky dealt with this brilliantly in the book we were talking about, Crime and Punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Raskolnikov was profoundly influenced by the intellectuals of his time who had all these theories.
Yep.
One of the theories was that this older woman who had wealth, she was socially useless. Therefore, getting rid of her and spreading her wealth somewhere else, giving it to someone who might do more with it or has less, you could do that with impunity. And of course, that kind of thinking gave birth to the Bolshevik Revolution and the whole millions that were murdered coming out of that just because they were in the wrong class. Anyway, so that at the end of the year, they were not, I think, terribly pleased with my result. And so I had no other job. So I sat down and it took me 2 or 3 weeks, I think, writing in the evenings to write norms. And all norms was the problem with norms. I mean, if I could be sort of self-critical for a moment, it isn't really written to an audience. It was written long before there was a classical school movement in America.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I was writing it to myself. What I was trying to do, I told my wife this, I had spent this whole year studying education generally, and I felt I needed to capture the learning of that year for myself before I moved on with my life. Otherwise, it was just a lost year in my life. And so I was writing pretty much to myself, which I think explains, you talked about the density of the book, sometimes the expression. Sometimes, honestly, Adrienne, I read it now and I wonder, what was I thinking? What is that? What am I trying to say there? So it's not as sort of lucid and clear, just beautifully expressed as I would like it to have been. But I think there is a lot of kind of like mining. I mean, there's a lot of gold in those hills, but you have to also dig out all the dirt to get to the gold. But anyway, that's the story of how I got into education. And I tried a number of other things, but they just didn't work for me. So I ended up heading schools all my life.
That's amazing. Oh, so tell us a little bit about the schools you've headed. I think our listeners might enjoy hearing that too.
The first school I headed, actually, I turned down an offer. I was working as a carpenter's assistant in rural Georgia, making minimum wage. Not a great start for a young man who's just gotten married and is about to expect his first child. But I turned down the first school offer. I wanted to head a school, and I was still very young. So that was going to be a challenge. I wanted to head a school that would be open to my ideas. And the first school that offered me the job, I won't name it, but they were a very secular, progressive school. And I just felt they're headed in the wrong direction. And I'm going to walk into just a lot of headwind if I go to that school, especially as a young person. And then the board at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Jackson, Mississippi, they were actually contemplating closing the school because they had accumulated so much debt, and through a series of personal connections that we don't need to go into, I was offered the job, and I saw it as a chance to, here's a school that was more or less in a desperate situation, and that's a perfect school for a young guy who's got his own ideas to walk into. So I went there. Every teacher in the high school resigned that almost immediately, as the biology teacher explained to me, who was about my age of all things. He said, none of us can work for somebody younger than we are. So, and my response to him, I remember it, I said, well, something, that's something all of us eventually have to outgrow. We all end up working for people younger than we are.
That's so true.
Yeah. And so anyway, but it was a blessing for me because some of them I know would have resisted what I wanted to do, left, and I hired people who were sympathetic to my ideas, and many of them were, oh, frankly, old friends of mine
Mm-hmm.
who one of them who passed away just in '96. One of my best friends, Steve Gallup, he was a PhD from UCLA, had his master's from Oxford, was working for UNESCO in Paris at the time, making, I think, as I recall, $60,000 a year, which was a pile of money back in that day. But Steve was independently wealthy, spoke several languages fluently, just a brilliant guy, had his PhD in history. And he heard I had taken this job where I was writing, we wrote all the time. He said, well, would you let me come and teach at your school? And I said, Steve, I can't afford to pay you. I mean, you're way overqualified. I can't afford to pay you. And he said, oh, I don't need to be paid. I hate what I'm doing here. I'm sitting at a desk doing nothing in Paris and they're paying me all this money. I just like to be with young people and I'd like to teach.
That's beautiful.
So I said, well, absolutely. And he was one of several extremely influential teachers in that little school starting out. But, you know, I rewrote the curriculum. We got the budget under control. And by the time I left, the school had purchased 100 acres on the Natchez Trace Parkway. We had built a master plan for a beautiful new school. I mean, it was wonderful, wonderful experience. And sometimes I think I should have just stayed there because I love Mississippi. In fact, went back and visited the school 3 or 4 years ago. It's now an amazing school. If anyone living in the Jackson area, they probably all know it, but you've done a good job. Anyway, that's probably more than you or your audience wants to know, but that's sort of where I started out. And then from there, I was recruited to St. Mark's School of Texas, which is probably the best school I ever headed. It's a boys' school, but a really remarkably, just an amazing school. A lot of type A boys with type A parents. But I had a terrific board there, very supportive of, when you go into an environment like that, a school that has a great track record, it's very established and is drawing students from, very successful families, you always confront a great deal of entitlement in a school like that. It's very hard to change things. And the teachers usually also have that same sense of entitlement. They want to be left alone. They want to teach the way they want to teach and what they want to teach in their classrooms. That makes it a good challenge to have because you have to change that mindset, but a very difficult one. And what you need in that situation, I have found, is a really strong board that supports you and your mission and your goals, and is willing to support you through the white water you're going to experience when all of these other teachers who are smarter than you are and know more than you are, et cetera, push back. And I had that board at St. Mark's in Dallas, and I was there for 9 years. It was probably the most successful years of my professional life.
Was that before or after you had written Norms and Nobility?
None of these schools was before Norms and Nobility.
Oh, okay.
Norms was written, as I say, before I went to Jackson.
Okay.
And Norms became, of course, we didn't have we weren't talking back in that day about classical education. Norms was taken for me as a kind of blueprint of what I wanted to do at St. Andrews. And then the thing that some people make a mistake when they read Norms, and I think, because, I go from the theoretical section into the practical section. And they move into the practical section and say, oh, this is great. We have the whole syllabus and curriculum for the last 6 years of school. that was not my intention at all. As I say in the book, I said, this is just to give people a feeling for what kinds of things, what kinds of books and projects and whatever that, but my intention was that people would bring their own stuff to that and teach the stuff they love, but in the spirit in which it's talked about in the book, and with the focus on great literature, great history, proven things rather than just their own personal taste.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Well,
that's good.
since we're still talking about norms and nobility, I'm gonna let's focus a little bit on that, and then we'll. I want to talk. I want our listeners to hear about your other projects that I'm really excited about. But before we do that, let's talk about this quote on page 18. So my favorite quote in your book is on page 18. And I was delighted when I read your introduction to the new book coming out that St. Vladimir's Press is going to be publishing, that the only quote from Norms and Nobility that you have in that introduction is the very quote that is my hill to die on page 18. And people who listen to my podcast know what this quote is. So I'd like you to read it. And then what we would all be blessed is to hear you explain what it means and expand on it. That would be wonderful if you would be willing to do that.
Well, Adrian, I'd be happy to read it. Although expanding on it, I might just have to start rereading norms. Because that's what I tried to do in the book. As we talked about, this quote is really, happens at the very beginning of the book.
Mhm.
And I intended it as a sort of thesis statement for the whole book. This is what I really want to explain in my book and defend. And before I read it, I also want to say one other thing about it. One of my goals, again, remember this is before we talk about classical education, but I was talking about I use the terms classical education because I was talking about, that ancient form of learning that our ancestors had inherited, and we're struggling to duplicate. But I didn't want to talk about it in terms of like the quadrivium and the trivium, great books, or phonics versus whole language, or I wanted to get away from that, or studying Greek and Latin, which was a standard view of classical education when I went to school. If you do majoring in classics, that means you're reading Greek and Latin. And I wanted to try to extract from all of that sort of the underlying principles of classical education and express it in a way that would reach out, would embrace a wider, all children.
Yes.
This is something that all children should have, and I don't believe that all children need to, study antique Greek or learn forms of trivium and quadrivium and that kind of thing. I'm not against that stuff.
Correct. Right.
So anyway, here's the quote: "Classical education is not preeminently of a specific time or place. It stands instead for a spirit of inquiry and a form of instruction concerned with the development of style through language and of conscience through myth." The key word here is inquiry. Everything springs from the special nature of the inquiry. The inquiry dictates the form of instruction and establishes a moral framework for thought and action.
I want to take just a minute to announce that Karen Glass is going to be offering a book study of Norms and Nobility. I have her here with me to tell you about the book study as well as a few other things she's doing with our beautiful teaching team. So Karen, can you just take a minute and tell our listeners about all the offerings you have for us this year?
All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and have a book study for Norms and Nobility. There's a new affordable edition that's going to be coming out on August 6th, which is available for pre-order now on Amazon. And so we'll begin our book study on September 3rd, and we'll read through that at a nice slow pace of taking just meeting once every 2 weeks to discuss each chapter. We'll also have an offline aspect to that class so that on Canvas, so our students or people in the class will be able to have, offline discussions and have access to all of my extensive study notes that go along with norms and nobility. In addition to that, I will be speaking at the Vital Ideas conference that Adrian is hosting on the subject of how important vital ideas are as the mind food for our children. I'll also be offering 2 classes in July on narration, very specific seminars for students who are just ready to begin written narration and for students who are ready to transition from written narration into formal composition. And there's more details about that on the website.
All right. Thank you, Karen. And all of the information that Karen just mentioned is going to be in the show notes. Registration for the conference is in the show notes with a discount code. And the registration for her Norms and Nobility book study is coming soon. So to stay up to date with all of her courses, please register for our Beautiful Teaching newsletter so that you don't miss any of the registrations for any of her sessions. So just look at the show notes of this episode or subscribe for our newsletter at beautifulteaching.com. So now we are going to return to the interview with David Hicks, where you will hear him reread the quote that he just read before we took this break.
Classical education is not preeminently of a specific time or place. It stands instead for a spirit of inquiry and a form of instruction concerned with the development of style through language and of conscience through myth. The key word here is inquiry. Everything springs from the special nature of the inquiry. The inquiry dictates the form of instruction and establishes a moral framework for thought and action. I don't know where does one begin expounding on that, but I think the reason this is an important sort of thing, and I know it's what you're doing in your efforts to teach, with beautiful teaching, is to try to understand everything we do in terms of development of style through language and conscience through myth. If that's not where things are leading in terms of our questions, the questions we're asking, with the works we're studying, the projects we're working on, if that's not leading in that direction, then we probably should just prune it away. It's probably not really what we're interested in. It's certainly not what I would regard as the intention or purpose of a classical education. Even in terms of the study of Latin and Greek, what you're learning when you're studying Latin and Greek ultimately is style through language. And we all have, and style includes a broad range of things. It includes your form of courtesy, how you present yourself as a human being to other human beings. Are you affirming of them? Are you humble in the face of what they have accomplished or what they can teach you and bring to you? Are you looking for the divine, image in them, or are you just looking at whatever is superficial? So that's a part of, when you're studying books, you're looking for that in the characters in the books, and of course, as the quote talks about, it says, you're developing a young person's conscience through myth. Now, there are sort of the modern view of conscience is that it's merely a social construct, that, conscience isn't something that is real. It's just whatever your culture or your environment tells you is good or bad. It's all socially constructed, or nowadays politically constructed. And that's definitely, I think that's a misreading of the classical tradition. The classical tradition says, everybody, that we can reject it because it's socially constructed. I think the reality is that we accept it because it's socially constructed. These are norms that have proven over generations to be important for human development and human health. And to throw them out and say, oh, it's just a socially constructed, we can construct something else. We can.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'll give you a really devastating example in our time. That's what Vladimir Lenin did. That's what the Bolsheviks did. They said, they turned the whole thing on its head, and they said that being that everything good and bad is a matter of who has the that goodness is whatever some elite defines it to be, and they define it to be that way in order to preserve or enhance their own power and influence. So everything comes out of this. Nietzsche called it the will to power, the will to control. And so what we need in this term, the elite or those who have privilege, they develop the morality of their place, okay? And they do it for the purpose of enhancing or preserving their own position. And that's and of course, in my reference to the Bolsheviks, I mean, they did it. They believed everything. They based their thinking on writings of Marx, and they believed that there was this perpetual class warfare between the oppressed and the oppressors, the haves, the have-nots, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie. And that led to a morality that said, if you remember the bourgeoisie, you, back to Raskolnikov, you shouldn't exist. Right. And so in the 20s and the 30s, I mean, if you owned a cow or your parents owned a cow and you were a kulak, well, it's my moral obligation to kill you.
Right.
Right. And so they had the whole thing turned on its head. And that's why I say there, the development of conscience through myth.
Well, this is also what happened in the French Revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And the thing about, when I talk about myth, what I mean about myth is something much broader than just, not talking about myth.
I'm glad you expand on myth, because that's one of the questions that people ask when we talk about this quote in my class. And I try to explain it, but I'd love to hear it from your perspective.
Well, the new book, I try to hold on to that, and let me pull something up here, which I define it in that book, and I haven't really memorized my own definition.
Okay, and for our listeners to know what you mean by the new book, are you talking about the new edition of Norms and Nobility that's coming out?
No, I'm talking about The Stones Cry Out.
Okay.
The book that Cap is presenting and will probably come out later this year. Okay, here's my definition. It's a very short paragraph, and I'll read it. Let's be clear from the start about what we mean and don't mean by myth, or in Greek, mythos. A myth is not a story, as some believe, that is untrue, nor is it a story, as others believe, that is an historical account of something that actually happened once upon a time. Nor is it a primitive tale unworthy of belief. There are modern myths, as well as ancient ones, that intelligent, well-educated people put their faith in. For the purposes of this book and the wall I'm building, a myth is a story told in symbolic language describing historically improbable and unrepeatable manifestations of continually repeated eternal truths about the nature of reality.
So Crime and Punishment would fall in that category, correct?
Oh, yes. And I'm not saying these things could not or did not happen historically, but I'm saying they're highly improbable as they're described. And they're unrepeatable. You can't repeat that story in exactly that shape. But I'm saying it's of continually repeated eternal truths about the nature of reality. In other words, what happened in that book has happened millions, thousands of times. By the way, I mean, we know that in Bolshevik Russian, it happened millions of times because people were being killed on the basis of some theoretical thinking. Let me give you a modern example of that. Do you know the writer Jane Jacobs? Yeah. She wrote a book called the Death of the American City, something like that.
Okay.
The Destruction and Death. It came out in the late 60s. And what she was watching, she was living through this. And she's not an academic. She wasn't teaching at a university or anything, but she was watching what was happening to the inner life of cities like Boston, New York, Los Angeles, other places, Chicago, where this theoretical thinking of, it was at the time called the Garden City, where they looked at these areas of the city that were impoverished, and they just bulldozed them and built these huge high-rise projects, right? Over 200 communities in America were destroyed that way by this theory. And as she pointed out, because she lived in these communities, she said these communities, they didn't look good to to the upper middle class theoretician who drove through them. Sometimes they were even called slums. But she said, they had very low crime rates. Education was quite good. There was strong community, a strong sense of community. There were a lot of really healthy things going on in these communities. And yet the theoretical thinkers said, oh, it's much better if we bulldoze those communities, put all these people in a 40, in a high-rise building that, offers them flushing toilets or whatever whatever they are lacking. And then we'll surround these buildings because there'll be enough land to sort of for open space, or the garden city idea. But what she pointed out is that because of that, these open spaces basically became war zones for gangs. And because there was the old system, she makes many wonderful points, but the old system is everybody knew everybody else and their kids in the neighborhood.
Exactly. Right.
And they all had their eyes on the street. I mean, the highest, you look out the window and you'd see what's going on in the street. And so those communities were policing themselves and raising their own children.
Yep.
Whereas in the high rise, no one knew.
I know exactly what you're talking about. This is like, I grew up in Akron, Ohio. My grandparents, this is what they grew up in, were these types of communities, and they were hanging their clothes to dry outside, and the women were talking to each other and disciplining all the kids that are playing out there. This is exactly what Wendell Berry is talking about in his book, The Unsettling of America, which you probably read. It's an older book, but the first chapter of that book, he's talking about the same thing.
Well, this is just one example. There are tons of the whole phonics, whole language thing. These theories that come out of the universities, I mean, they're well-intentioned, but they're so stupid and so wrong-headed and not based in reality. And that was, my book, The Stones Cry Out. I'm trying to say, let's look at, here is the mythos of reality we find in the proto-myths in the Bible. Nothing has replaced those. All these modern theories, whether they come out of science or reason or the imagined self, they're so inferior to those proto-myths, but they all have their own myths, which I talk about in the book. And I don't know if you probably read, I mean, my good old state of Mississippi. I mean, we were always last, or I'm not really a Mississippian, but it was always last in terms of reading comprehension scores in all the states. And then this, very lovely, wealthy Mississippian who made his money in California and came back to his state, came back with the view, well, instead of teaching whole language, which is what the education establishment all wanted to teach, let's return to phonics and see if that will help move Mississippi forward. And within 3 or 4 years, Mississippi is now in the middle of all these states. And the kids who have really benefited from it, all have benefited, but the ones that have really turned it around are kids from poor, underprivileged, low-income backgrounds. Because the truth is, if we know about, in my view, and every sort of research done on this topic shows that these phonics kids are doing better than whole language kids, and that's been going on for years. But will the university change its view? No. They're controlled by this quote unquote elite group of educators who are convinced that whole language is the way to go. Now, but the thing is about whole language is that if you're really bright and you grow up in a family where mom and dad read books all the time and read to you and give you that kind of exposure to reading and to the written word and to language, well, yes, you probably will pick up the language through whole language. You'll
Sure.
recognize.
That makes complete sense. Yeah.
But if you don't have that kind of background,
Or if English is your second language because you've immigrated.
good point. If any, absolutely. And of course, we're a nation full of immigrants right now. So I come back to this idea. It's that all this theoretical thinking that is going on is not, it's not helpful. I mean, honestly, I'm pretty highly trained product of these universities, but I see them, and now, of course, we have this in their new theories, critical race theory and other critical theories, that I think they're well-intentioned, but they're doing exactly, the effect of them is exactly the opposite of what the intention is. And so, anyway, classical education, back to that, the inquiry. The inquiry approach is really a humble-minded approach. And the first thing one would ask in an inquiry approach, say critical race theories, what are the effects of this going to be if we apply these ideas? If we become if everything is judged on the basis of skin color, or everything is judged on the basis of social class, or everything is judged on the basis of some other characteristic, what might be the consequences of this for our community? And
that's a seminar question right there. That's a great question. But you're right. That's exactly what should be being asked. And I feel like we're raising students today to not know how to think. They don't know how to have a spirit of inquiry. They don't know how to think ahead. They don't know how to think past the nose on their face. To think about the consequences, because our schools are failing them to be able to do that, which is why we have this classical education school movement happening, because we know whatever we've been doing isn't working, and that this spirit of inquiry really is a huge foundation to how we need to be teaching our children. So I know that from what I've read in your book, in Norms and Nobility, and what I've read in your Introduction to Classical Education, in a Secular World, this introduction to the new book, not the Stone Scrap, but the Orthodox Classical Christian Education book. The root here is that we need to go back to what dialectics are. What does it mean to have an education rooted in dialectic? So maybe we need to kind of expand a little bit on what does that mean? What does that look like? If you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Well, as everybody who's read Plato knows, is the whole idea of dialectics comes from him. And he uses Socrates, who was his teacher, as his interlocutor, or the person who exemplifies dialectical learning. And as you know, and anyone can read any of the dialogues, and they'll see this. Socrates always begins with a group of young people and asks them a question. What do you think justice is? And some bold student will throw out his answer. Thrasymachus says, well, justice is the strong doing what they want and the weak doing what they're told, something like that. And then Socrates comes back with questions like, well, look at this, would that apply to this situation? Or is that really fair to these people? Or, however he might do it. And then the students, of course, everyone complains that Plato always makes everything turn out all right in the end. But then the students would say, well, maybe that's not what we mean. Maybe we have to change the definition a little bit to reflect, our answers to these other questions you're asking. And then he comes right back at them and says, oh, that's probably a better definition, but yet it misses this, doesn't it? Isn't there a problem with it over here? And the dialectical approach, what I've said is, if you think about it, it's all how all of our minds work, especially young minds. As soon as someone makes a statement, the mind automatically says, just as Eve's mind said in the garden, is that really true? Do I believe that? Or that goes to the opposite extreme. No, that's not true. The opposite is true, or something else is true. That we all have these dialectical minds if they're not put to sleep.
Right. If they're not put to sleep, that's right.
So what we do with students is we encourage them to challenge new ideas. But if we're good teachers, we challenge them right back, not by saying you're wrong, but by saying, well, have you considered this? Or how would you apply that idea to this? Or so that we lead them through our questions deeper into an understanding of the topic, rather than try to cut off debate and say, well, we can't talk about that, or that's a racist statement, or that's a bigoted statement.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to insert an example for my listeners, because this is like my area that I love, my playground in education that I love is K through 6th grade, really, K through 8.
Right.
And so I
Best
talk to
year.
people like you, and you're bringing it up to this wonderful junior high, high school, college level, which is great. Now, how do you do this in an elementary classroom? So simple. So simple. When you're teaching grammar and you have your sentence on the board and you're asking the student, like, where's the noun in this sentence? And then a student raises their hand, says what the noun is. The teacher's like, right, okay, now where's the adjective? Okay, stop right there. That's not the way to teach. What you do is you say, very simple, how do you know it's a noun? Explain how you know it's a noun. So right there in the elementary classroom, you're engaging that dialectical, you're strengthening the dialect, you're engaging a conversation with the student. So this art of teaching has to do with just always, whenever a student gives an answer, always asking another question. It's that simple.
Absolutely. Yeah,
and you can do it in kindergarten.
You can, or point at the verb and say, why isn't that a noun?
Exactly.
Or
Yes.
How does that verb change the direction or meaning of the noun?
Right. And if you're teaching math, how do you teach math classically? You have a conversation about an equation, you call the students to the board, and you ask them to walk them through, show the class how you got that answer step by step. And when the student puts an answer, like a step on the board, the student can turn around to the class and go, does anybody agree or disagree with this, right? They can have these conversations when they're 7 years old.
And by the way, what you're describing, Adrian, is in terms of the best pedagogy we know of right now for teaching math, it's probably Singapore math. And that's what Singapore math tries to do, is tries to get students to think mathematically rather than just
yes. I will put a plug in. Right Start Math does the same thing.
Good. Okay.
I love Right Start. So yes, they're both very good programs. And there's a group called the Number Lab in Austin that also trains teachers in this method of mathematical teaching. It's very good. But
good.
So I think this spirit of inquiry is what I caught on to when I just, this is the quote that's my hill to die on in your book. And then training teachers in how to create this spirit of inquiry in your classroom. How do you do this? Teachers need to be equipped when they have a study guide for a literature book, how to identify questions that are actually not gonna strengthen the dialectic and engage the students in the book. So they need to be not asking just basic comprehension questions to make sure they read it. They actually need to be going into these normative dialectical questions. That's what creates the spirit of inquiry in the classroom. And it starts, what you say in your book is it starts with curiosity and wonder, which I'm happy. I've known this forever because I've been doing Charlotte Mason, but I'm so happy that it seems in the last 2 years, the classical education movement is finally understanding that beauty matters and so does curiosity and wonder. Those 3 things have been missing from the classical education movement for years, but Charlotte Mason's always done that, and so did Socrates.
Yeah. Charlotte Mason she's just wonderful. Yeah.
So okay, so we've been talking about norms and nobility. I really would like to introduce our listeners to your new book that I'm excited about because you and I are both Orthodox. My listeners know that I'm Orthodox, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this. So, my question for you, as you're in the process of working with St. Vladimir's Press to publish this anthology, I believe it's called Orthodox Christianity and Classical Education. I'd like you to share with our listeners what this project is about and why it matters not only for Orthodox Christians, but for all Christians.
Sure. Well, first, of course, I'm doing this with Father Anthony Gilbert, and it's really not our book. I mean, what an anthology, I want to bring a lot of voices into the conversation. And one of the reasons for that is in all these voices, there are 22 chapters in the book. All are written by Orthodox Christian men and women. Some of them, we have college professors. We have, you've already mentioned Gregorian, who you've had on your.
Vegan Gregorian, yep.
Yep, and Chris Perrin, Andrew Kern. I mean, we have
Brian Smith.
Yeah, Brian Smith, absolutely. Wonderful writers. Professor Konstas at the University of Boston.
Yes.
I'm sure some of your listeners will know of his work. He's really brilliant.
Oh, we need to get him on the podcast.
Yeah, there you go. Anyway, so the idea is to just have this conversation with a lot of really interesting people who approach it quite differently. I mean, Father Constance, who we've already mentioned, he just talks about music and the role of music in classical education in a very wonderful way. But what I try to say in the introduction is, I don't want classical education to be someone comes forward and says, oh, this is what it is. You have to learn Greek and Latin. You have to do this. Or you have to, do the quadrivium. You have to do the trivium. That's, that might work, but it's not, we need to see classical education as a conversation going on among a lot of caring, intelligent people who share the same ends that we do. Mm-hmm. And the biggest one, of course, is the desire for young people to grow up to be virtuous. Think of all those virtues, to have those virtues and live out their virtues in their lives. And then there are other goals too, but that's really the core. And how do we do that? How do we get there? And I see the anthology as a lot of thoughtful people trying to answer that question. Here's the best way to get there. Here's the best way. All within, I think, broadly speaking, a classical tradition. And that will probably not come out till later this year.
Okay.
And by the way, I should say that it was seminary that approached us and asked us to write the book.
Oh, really?
They St. Vladimir's is very interested, especially the president, Father Chad. He would like the seminary to encourage parishes to start schools in the classical tradition. And I think he sort of sees this, and not only to start them, but he would like the seminary to support them by perhaps offering online teacher education, things like that, which would expand the role of the seminary, I think, in a way that would be really helpful to Orthodox Christians, both presbyters and lay people.
Mm-hmm. So tell our listeners a little bit about Orthodox, the history of the Orthodox as the ancient church and what their education looked like. So this would be early Christian education.
Yeah.
What did that look like?
Well, we know quite a bit actually about what it looked like, but we never read about it or we never study it. But there were very early schools in Nisibis, Alexandria, Aleppo, places like that. Arjun was one of the early teachers or designers of classical education. I think it was the church at the school in Nisibis. This is in the second century, I mean, very early. There were some things, pretty radical things about it. For example, the students all learned to read by reading the Psalter.
Mm-hmm.
And that was right from the beginning. They were taught from the Psalter. And every day they would gather as a whole school community and recite from memory the Psalms. If you can imagine all of them doing that with the teachers. That was their kind of the both the spiritual center of the school, but also what brought them all together and what taught them. Of course, there was a much greater emphasis on memory than we have now,
Mm-hmm.
which of course I talk about in norms, and on content. I mean, those are the two things that have really been leached out of modern education is, memory and content.
Mm-hmm.
And but one of the wonderful things about this particular school that I love is that any decision, the decision to hire a headmaster or any decision involving serious discipline, it was taken to the whole student body and they voted on it. Now, if you can imagine a modern school in which, okay, we're going to interview a few people to be the headmistress or the headmaster, and now you're going to vote, you students, first grade through whatever, you will vote on who you think should be the head. Or we have this student who is really badly misbehaved, and what do you think should happen to this student? What should be our response to this behavior?
So it's almost like they were modeling it off of the church council concept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and think of the education for them that goes into that process. How do we build a community that functions well, that loves and respects every member, but that doesn't that offers penalties that help people grow rather than just throws them to the curb.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's just so many things that come out of that. But anyway, yes, there are these early church schools. I mean, if you get back to Orthodox, I mean, it would behoove anyone. I mean, you could be a 21st century Pentecostal, and if you want to give a child a classical education, it just makes sense to go back to the ancient church, which is the Orthodox Church. I mean, Christianity wasn't invented in Germany in the 15th century, and and the thing about the Orthodox Church, which one of the things I really like, is that it has had its good moments in history and its bad moments in history, but those moments have not changed the core of belief, the teachings of the church. It has the convictions and beliefs that St. Paul had, or that are just, even if they're culturally not current or they're personally difficult. I mean, when I read the epistles, I find some of the teachings personally challenging. Do I really agree with that? My dialectical mind at work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in my book on norms, as you know, I have a chapter on the importance of dogma. And the idea that there are some things, that they're going to stand out there and we're going to accept that as an absolute truth, even though we're going to challenge it. We may not agree with it, but we know that it's a mirror. It's something that we're holding up to ourselves and we're not measuring up to it. And we may have our rationalization, we may have our excuse, we may have another social construct about what it should be. But that's always going to be there. And we're going to, it's kind of like we're a knife, right? And that's a whetstone. We're going to be rubbing our knife against that whetstone, and that will make us better.
Well, I want our listeners to hear a little bit about how they could stay in touch with you and up to date with your work, because it sounds like you've got, a couple of great projects coming out.
Circe.
Okay.
Circe actually approached my brother and me. My brother's a classicist, and asked us to do this translation of Plutarch's Lives.
Yes.
And I think we've completed our project, but we've done 3 books based upon his lives for young people. It's annotated. So the reviews have been, embarrassingly positive. People who've read the lives in older translations have found them difficult, and they love our translation. And we haven't done them down. We've just put them in modern English rather than Victorian English. And then, of course, there's our most popular book, which I think is a really great book for every classical student ought to read, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It's brilliant. It's been called the most important book of the ancient tradition, and certainly so many of those church fathers you're talking about, of those ancient Christians, they were Stoics before they converted. I mean, this was basically their core belief. Stoicism is becoming the default position of our secular world. It's amazing how much you read about Marcus Aurelius, particularly about Epictetus, Seneca, the ancient Stoics, because they were they contained a lot of wisdom. They were the kinds of people that St. Basil would want you to investigate. And that book is done by Scribner, and they have just come out with a new paper. We sold over 150,000 copies in hardcover, and they've just come out with a very inexpensive, I think under $10, softcover version of it. But they're calling it
for schools. Yeah, so students could have them.
The hardcover version, we retitled it The Emperor's Handbook because actually it never had a title in antiquity. The earliest manuscript we have of it was across the top of it is written in someone's hand for himself. And but then when it started entering the Western tradition, it was brought in as called the Meditations. And so now it's called Meditations, and Scribner has decided they're going to name the paperback Meditations.
Okay.
Which is fine. I don't particularly like that title for it, but it is this title that usually goes by. And
okay.
But it's very accessible. I've used it with young people. They love it. I read it the first time when I was in high school, and it just blew me away. It was such a wise piece of writing. So
they could are all of these books available on the CRC website?
Probably are.
The Plutarch ones, I know they are. The states. What are the three titles? The Statesman,
the Lawgivers, the Statesman, and the Tyrant.
And is there a certain order to read them in?
That would be the best order.
And if you were doing these in a school, what grades would you recommend?
Middle school.
Okay.
Or high school. It would. The Tyrant was the last one we did. It's Plutarch's Life of Julius Caesar. It's a longer life, but it's not maybe 80 pages. I mean, it's not a big book. But we paired it with Shakespeare's play on Julius Caesar because we wanted to show how Shakespeare used Plutarch, who was his primary source, how he changes the story, how he embellishes it, how he leaves some things out in order to create a really impactful, dramatic, more focused kind of play. And of course, he's writing his play in Jacobin England, right? I think James I, who had the King James translation of the Bible made, he had become the king, and it's a pretty dangerous thing to write a play on the tyrant Julius Caesar, critical of him when the new king is coming into power. So we talked about how sort of Shakespeare had to negotiate all of that.
Oh, interesting. So in that book is the play is in that book?
Yes, it is. It's
so
the play with our footnotes. Our footnotes are related to commenting.
So they would read the Plutarch version first, then do the play. That would be a brilliant way to implement this in a classical school.
Oh, I think it would be amazing, particularly in this year when there's so much talk about, Trump is a tyrant and whatever. I mean, you have to.
Everyone's a tyrant. Everybody in government is a tyrant. That's the conversation.
The thing is that about Plutarch's life, and there were so many great things about Julius Caesar. You know,
Yeah.
we in our introduction we talk about tyrannos, the Greek word which is used. It was not, strictly speaking, a pejorative. For example, Oedipus Rex. Okay, well, it's actually Oedipus Tyrannus, right? The
Mm-hmm.
tyrant. But Oedipus is not viewed as a bad guy. He's viewed as a kind of a victim of a situation
Mm.
who did good things for not Colonus, but Thebes. So, yeah, again, back to our little discussion about dialectics, it's more complicated than that's a bad person or that's a good person. That bad person did some good things. That good person did some bad things. And that's Plutarch's whole point with all of his lives.
Right.
Perfect for classical education because he says right at the beginning of his writing the lives, he said, I'm writing these lives not to talk about all of the historical incidents and the great battles and all of that. I'm writing these lives to show young people, because he wrote them for young people. I'm writing these lives to show young people how to live a good life.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to draw from these characters, whether they're generally good or bad, the traits worthy of emulation and the traits to avoid. It's
Mm-hmm.
a character study, really. But anyway, yeah.
I'm so glad you're bringing up Plutarch. This is one of the reasons why I also instantly categorized Charlotte Mason as a classical educator was because she was having all of her students read Plutarch.
Yeah.
And yet all of these classical schools I was working with, none of them were reading Plutarch. And I'm like, wait a minute. If you're
Yeah.
going to be a classical school, you should probably be reading Plutarch.
Well, if you look at education before, I don't know, before the year 1900, all students read Plutarch. I mean, Plutarch
Oh
became,
yeah, you know the musical Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. Millie is on the wagon coming in with Adam, and she's like, "My mother gave me this, and it's a Bible." And she goes, "My father gave me this, and it's the Lives of Plutarch." And all of my kids, when they're like, "Oh, we know what Plutarch is," you know.
exactly. So it's amazing that he's dropped out. But on the other hand, I can see because he is celebrating traditional virtues, even though they're not
Exactly.
virtues. And of course, we're very uncomfortable with pushing virtue in our schools.
Yeah. Well, and Charlotte Mason categorized Plutarch under the study of citizenship. Her
Yeah,
whole citizenship curriculum was the study of Plutarch and Shakespeare. History. History come under that as well.
yeah,
But yeah, this has been amazing. So I'll put in the show notes some ways that people can find your books and links that they can go to. And then my concluding question that I always ask my guest to close our episode is to answer one of two questions. What is a quote from a book that has had a huge impact on you? Or what book do you wish you had read sooner in your life?
I'll give you very succinct answers to those two questions. There are two really quick quotes that I think about a lot. One is, of course, Dostoevsky's quote, "Beauty will save the world." How is that going to happen? And that really, anyway, I think about that a lot. I also like a quote that actually, I think it was Nietzsche's. Nietzsche said it originally. Of course, he's viewed as a kind of bad character. Um, but he had a lot of interesting things to say. Anyway, he said, "There is no birth of consciousness without suffering," and Dostoevsky quotes him in Notes from Underground. And I think for young people, for me personally, I mean, all of our lives contain a certain amount of suffering, all of them. And if we look back, like I'm an old man now, and I look back on my life, and I realize that there was really not just beauty in my suffering, but there was learning, there was there was birth of consciousness, either a deeper understanding of myself, or a deeper understanding of those around me, or a deeper understanding of God. I mean, it took suffering to push me to that level, and I'm sure there are many levels I could go to that are higher, but I probably won't get there without
Mhm.
experiencing pain.
Mhm.
Those are the two quotes. And yeah, and I love James Norris Cochrane's book. You probably know it, Christianity and Classical Civilization, I think it's called. He is such a wonderful writer. It's a pretty big book, but if you really want to get into sort of the pillars of classical education, Cochrane it's just a brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, that was awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm thrilled that you took some time to be with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Adrian. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being such a fun interlocutor. I've enjoyed it. And God bless you as you continue to spread the lesser gospel of classical education.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for listening. You can get involved in a few ways. There's a Facebook page where we actively discuss the ideas around classical education. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/classical education. And if you want to help offset our production costs, you can support the podcast financially by going to www.classicaleducationpodcast.com/support. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once said, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be in a few words this: they will know what it is to see the sky, they will know what it is to breathe it, and they will know best of all what it is to behave under it as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."